Today on Blue 58, it's time to look back at what could be Brian Gutekunst's biggest swing as a general manager, selecting Jordan Love in the first round of the 2020 NFL Draft.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, happy to be with you here for another episode. And as I kind of alluded to when we did our 2021 NFL draft redraft, the 2020 draft is hard one to get your arms around because of basically, well, on the timeline that we usually do these, we didn't have a good idea what Jordan Love was, and it's hard to look back on a draft class if you don't know how to contextualize the biggest selection in that draft. And the Jordan Love one has been it's been the subject of no shortage of conversation since it happened, some of which was pretty contentious even here on this podcast. I think maybe a little bit noteworthy in how it was different for how we talked about it at the time and even sometime since then. But it was a huge decision, a franchise-shaping one, and one that I feel like we need to take a look at. So I've been working on how to talk about this draft pick because I don't think it's as simple as good pick or bad pick. There's a lot of different things that go into it, especially with how it's shaped the franchise since then, and things that have played out as a result of Jordan Love being selected. So I have a bunch of different bullet points of topics kind of loosely organized into a couple different sections, and I kind of want to just talk through a bunch of things here. So maybe a little bit more freeform than some of our podcasts usually are. But I think that's okay. We can try to do some different stuff and go in some different directions. The first area I want to talk about is why do this at all? Why go back to the past? Why talk about stuff that's played out, essentially, that has been shaped and that has happened and that we've all experienced? So a couple different reasons. First, if you're a person who does takes in sports media, I think you owe it to your audience to hold yourself accountable a little bit. You can go back and forth with people's interpretations of your stuff, but if you don't go back and look at your own words and the things that you've said and put out there in sort of a self-driven manner, I think you're doing everyone you talk to and everyone who listens to you a disservice. So I want to differentiate as someone who actually looks back at what I said before and sorts it out. But more importantly, as I've talked about a little bit, this draft pick is a huge deal. It's essentially defined half a decade of Packers football since it happened, and hopefully it's going to determine the next decade plus of Packers football too if things continue to go kind of as they've gone for Jordan Love. So the pick itself, a couple of different things that I said at the time that I want to address. First, my very, very first gut-level reaction to Jordan Love being selected was to tweet the word indefensible. That is my biggest regret about the Jordan Love analysis situation, because I don't think any pick is really indefensible within reason. Anybody that you would reasonably pick in just about any round, you're going to have a case for that person. And there's very, very few situations where a pick would truly ever be indefensible. So I regret putting that word out there. It's one of the reasons that I've stopped going on Twitter at all, because I never want to be like prisoner of the moment type stuff. We want to do thoughtful analysis, try to be smarter Packers fans and smarter in the way that we talk about things, even in real time. I also said at the time that there are people that are basically in the Jordan Love archetype available just about every year. I still think that's true. I still think that there are people that broadly fit into the same category as Jordan Love from a scouting report perspective almost every year. There are guys that fit the profile of the big thrower, the big-armed guy, the big-armed athlete who hasn't quite put it together in just about every single draft class. Usually the money spot that I look for prospects in that range are guys that are in the 20 to 40 or maybe 20 to 50 range of the draft. And it's almost every season you can find somebody like that. This season is a little bit of an exception because we had 6 quarterbacks go in the top 12 picks and then nobody until the 5th round. But if you go back to 2021, you had Kyle Trask and Kellen Mond go at 66, 64, and 66, respectively, a little bit out of the range there. But basically that, these are guys that are imperfect prospects, but you feel like you might be able to coach them up. Kenny Pickett is not a big-armed thrower, but he was a successful college quarterback who had some warts coming into the draft, and someone talked themselves into him about pick number 20. In fact, exactly at pick number 20. 2023, Will Levis might be the best example, going 33rd. He probably fits this category the most, just the classic big arm throwing quarterback. So if you believe in quarterback development, and if you believe there are guys out there that could be coached up if they land in the right situation, that's the range you're looking for, that late first round, somebody maybe dropping back into the top of the second to get one of those prospects. I do think there are guys out there that fit that mold just about every year. Also want to throw out there the thing that you will commonly hear about drafting quarterbacks or the drafting quarterbacks in a situation like Jordan Love was drafted. The best time to draft a quarterback is when you don't need one. I remain pretty unswayed on this. I don't think that's true, and I don't think anybody actually does this. Everybody who drafts a quarterback in the first round thinks they need a quarterback. Otherwise, you wouldn't take one. Otherwise, you'd put your resources everywhere else. People throw out Aaron Rodgers. The Packers took Aaron Rodgers because they thought Brett Favre was about to retire, could retire at any time because he talked openly about retiring. We'll talk about the Packers' circumstances drafting Aaron Rodgers because that's part of it, but part of that was that they thought that Aaron Rodgers was closer to the end of his career than the beginning. They were going to need a quarterback sooner than later. You talk about Patrick Mahomes getting drafted by the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs did not draft Patrick Mahomes because they didn't think they were set at quarterback. They knew that they wanted a new quarterback sooner than later. Alex Smith was not going to take them to the promised land. He was not the long-term plan in Kansas City. I really can't think of a situation where somebody actually did not need a quarterback and they drafted one in the first round, because if you want to say that, what you're really meaning is we don't need one at this exact actual moment. We don't have an opening at starting quarterback. Okay, that's a much narrower definition than I think most people mean it when they're defending that point. We also have had the storyline since Love was drafted that drafting Jordan Love motivated Aaron Rodgers, and this is where I think we need to start getting into the context around the pick. I don't know if Aaron Rodgers was motivated by the selection of Jordan Love. I don't think you can discount the idea that it was a motivating factor for him, but it's hard for me to say that there was a one-to-one relationship between Jordan Love is drafted, Aaron Rodgers becomes good. Again, first, because we've pushed back on the narrative of how bad Rodgers was for a long time. If you contextualize things a little bit farther than just 2018 being a bad season and 2019 being a little bit not quite as great of a season as some people remember it, pushing it back into a broader context, there was a genuine Aaron Rodgers slump from about the middle of 2015 to about the middle of 2016. But you can find a 16-game stretch from the middle of 2016 till the time he broke his collarbone in 2017 where you can put that 16-game stretch, including playoffs, up against the best seasons that have ever been played at quarterback. It's there. It exists. You can go look up the numbers yourself. But after that, Aaron Rodgers breaks his collarbone. The rest of 2017 is essentially a lost season. 2018, things have really gone south with Mike McCarthy. Rodgers' play falls off. I think we can say that it fell off, but there were some internal issues there that I think needed to be addressed, as well as some overall talent issues on offense that had there had been some attrition on offense. And then 2019, I think it's important to point out that pretty much everybody who watched the Shanahan tree coaches prior to Matt LaFleur being hired in Green Bay said repeatedly and loudly that it takes almost a year or most of a year or at least a year for that offense to really settle in and take effect. Well, if you look at the numbers, Aaron Rodgers and the Packers offense were broadly the same in 2018 and 2019. But 2019 is the first year of LaFleur, and then what happens in 2020? Aaron Rodgers takes off, wins MVP, has perhaps his best statistical season ever. Is that just a motivated Aaron Rodgers, or is that the offense taking off as expected? There's some broader context there that I think you can't discount. So just saying that they needed to light a fire under Aaron Rodgers really, I don't think necessarily holds water, because I think Rodgers was better than people were giving him credit for, and there were some other factors that needed to be considered, and just the timeline for how this team was supposed to develop was basically right on track there, and it ended up being right on track with how he played through 2020. Speaking of that context, I think when you talk about takes surrounding the Jordan Love pick, we forget context a lot. 2018, Aaron Rodgers signs a 4-year extension. The extension was barely underway when Brian Gutekunst drafted Jordan Love. 2019, the Packers had a free agency bonanza. They signed Zadarius Smith, they signed Preston Smith, they signed Adrian Amos, and they signed Billy Turner. That is a win now signal if there ever was one. They go to the 2019 NFC Championship, and yes, they get hammered by the 49ers, but they're right there on the doorstep. They're overachieving. They're ahead of schedule on their Gutekunst-era rebuild. And as much as people have made of Aaron Rodgers, being surly and disappointed and stuff like that after the 2020 NFC Championship, here are his comments after 2019. Quote, "You realize how difficult it is to get here, but the beauty of this sport is it's a true team sport. You're relying on so many other people. And as we move into the offseason, the reliance is on guys doing their responsibilities and doing their part to be ready for next season. Who knows what can happen? It's a long year, but this one will always be special because it became fun again." End quote. Does that sound like a guy who's imminently retiring? I don't think so. It sounds like Aaron Rodgers is bought in. He's ready to go. He's doing what they want him to do in Green Bay. And look, there it is. He played well in 2020 and was part of their development timeline. So 2020, I think reasonably, you're looking at a situation where coming off the NFC Championship game, you're looking for that real load-up draft, the way that the Packers had here recently in 2023. Putting some context to that, I think the Packers very much were interested in adding pass catchers for their offense in that draft, but it seems like the Packers badly misread the wide receiver situation. They were reportedly tried to move up in the first round of 2020 to get wide receivers. They reportedly tried to move up from 62 to the middle of the second round to get more receivers and couldn't do it either time. It seems, from the outside looking in, like they thought guys were going to fall farther than they did. If they wanted one of the elite receivers in 2020, they were going to have to get up to the mid-teens, or I think Justin Jefferson was 21 to the Vikings. It's in that range, mid-teens or let's say 2021. They apparently did not think that, because that's a much bigger jump than they were willing to make, going from 30 to the mid-20s, which is what they did to select Jordan Love. And they shouldn't have thought that either. Looking back at the consensus mock draft board, let me run down the top 10 names or so here. Jerry Jeudy was 7th, CeeDee Lamb was 9th, Henry Ruggs III was 10th, Jefferson was 18th, Denzel Mims, there's a name from the history books for you, was 28th, T. Higgins was 33, Brandon Ayuk was 35, Michael Pittman was 41. Scrolling down a little bit more, Jalen Reagor at 42, Laviska Shenault at 44, KJ Hamler at 58, and Chase Claypool at 63. If the Packers thought that a receiver was going to be available for them to trade up to get at, say, 23, 24, or maybe 25, 26, that is contrary to the broad public opinion on where these receivers were going to go, because outside of a couple exceptions, maybe Ayuk, Claypool, Jalen Reagor, everybody went about where they were expected to, and those guys went higher. So they misread that situation. If they were hoping for a receiver to be there at 30 or 62 or even like 25, they were dreaming. It would just have been unlikely that would happen. So even if they wanted to add talent, they seemed to misread what was going on there. Looking more at the context there, I think there is, if you're Aaron Rodgers, and I know nobody wants to be Aaron Rodgers here in 2024, but if you're Aaron Rodgers circa spring 2020, I think you could really have some legitimate complaints about what Brian Gutekunst was trying to do or be or build at that point. What are we trying to build as this offense? Are we trying to be the 49ers? If so, why? To the extent that the 49ers have ever been successful in the Shanahan era, it's really only ever been because of efficient passing, not overpowering running. That's what really drives their success. That is what historically has driven their success. That is what has always been the main driver of the 49ers machine. Yes, they run the ball well, but it's as a complement to super efficient passing. They're very good at making efficiency, the generating efficiency as a passing offense. Whoever is their quarterback, they can find a way to be efficient passing the ball, and they do it super efficiently. Works hand in glove with their run game, sure, but running the ball is only ever a complement to passing the ball. That's how all offenses are in the NFL. And kind of related to that, when are we trying to build for? This is the old Ted Thompson frustration. We talked in the late Thompson era about picturing your window of contention as kind of a bell curve. You're building, climbing this hill, and you get to this crest where you're really in your elite contender status, and then you're over the hill, and then you either have to rebuild to try to scrape your way back up to the hill, or tear it all down and really bottom out so you can start building up another hill. The Ted Thompson era Packers, the late Ted Thompson era, say 2014 to 2017, always seemed to be like they were trying to just be at the front of that peak forever. never really getting all the way to that crest, but just trying to stay where they were and hope that would carry them. Aaron Rodgers would catch fire in the playoffs or whatever, and that would carry them to another Super Bowl. It never seemed like they leveraged fully where they were. And I think that frustration, if you're Aaron Rodgers, probably carried over early into the Brian Gutekunst era, because here we've got Aaron Rodgers signing an extension. Here we've got all this free agency money coming in. And then you spend 2 draft picks, because don't forget there was a 4th-round pick involved in the Jordan Love selection as well. And suddenly you're sitting there saying, we were just in the NFC title. Now we're spending 2 draft picks that objectively will not help us win a Super Bowl in 2020. It's not going to get us there this year. What's going on? But related to that, what are you trying to build? Here are the Packers' top 100 picks from 2018 through 2020. Jair Alexander, Josh Jackson, Oren Burks, Rashawn Gary, Darnell Savage, Elton Jenkins, Jace Sternberger, Jordan Love, A.J. Dillon, and Josiah DeGuara. It looks like they're trying to fix the defense. Did it ever get fixed? Not really in that era. But then they added pretty much only 2nd and 3rd tier support on offense. The biggest skill position player that they added, the most impactful skill position player that they tried to add in that stretch, was A.J. Dillon, who at the time was a 3rd-string running back. And then you've got Jace Sternberger, who that pick just looks worse and worse as time goes on. There was never a role for him in Green Bay, and really not in the NFL. He's kind of an undersized tight end, an under-athletic tight end who really only had 1 productive season in college. What are you trying to do here? What are you trying to accomplish with these most important picks? They did not have an identity. This team was just Aaron Rodgers and hope for the best around him when you're building in that era. As a related point, when it comes to context, I don't think we can ignore the cap shrinkage situation from COVID and how much that affected the Packers' ability to build around late career Rodgers. Historically, the cap has almost always gone up by about 5 to 7% per year. 2018, the cap was $177 million. A year later, it was $188. In 2020, it was up to $198 million. In 2021, because of the pandemic, it shrunk down to $182 million. And that's a significant dip. And by 2022, the cap was back up to $208 million. In 2021, the cap probably should have been around $208 million or so, conservatively. But instead, it was lower that season than it was in 2019. That's a significant drop. And it definitely impacted the Packers' ability to build around late-career Aaron Rodgers. You talk about Aaron Rodgers needing to take less. Well, how about the cap just keeps going up and Aaron Rodgers doesn't have such a significant cap hit anyway? And people should not take less. I am sick of that line of thinking. It's your obligation, not just to yourself, but to the rest of the players in your union to get as much as you can out of the owners. The cash flow needs to keep coming from the owners to the players. Do you think that if you cut the owners a break, they're just going to go out and spend more money that they now don't have to spend? I would invite you to find a situation in the history of ever where someone has invested more money than they had to get what they think they wanted. That it just does not happen. Get your money. The rest is going to take care of itself. If you're a good team, you're going to have a good season. So that is a significant factor here too. All of those considerations, all of those contextual things aside, here's the real question, and this is where I want to spend the next little bit here. First, or was I wrong? Was the take on Jordan Love at the time wrong? I think yes, but I think also no. I think you have objective truths on both sides here. First, picking Jordan Love in 2020 did hurt the Packers' chances in 2020, 2021, and 2022. I don't know how you get away from that, because the team was worse because they didn't have a player from the first round contributing in any of those 3 seasons after they took Love in the first round in 2020. The rebuttal you see often to that is they weren't one player away. Maybe that might be true, but I think we've also seen a lot of arguments on the other side that they were just one player away. Draft stuff aside, how big a difference would David Bakhtiari have made in 2020 or 2021? Draft picks included, we don't actually know how much one player would have helped either, but do you think they'd have been better in the 2020 NFC Championship game or the entire 2020 season with Patrick Queen on the field instead of either Christian Kirksey or Chris Barnes, or 2021 for that matter? Would they have been better in the red zone in 2020 with T. Higgins or Michael Pittman on the field instead of Equanimeous St. Brown and post-groin surgery Alan Lazard? Would they have been better at corner with L'Jarius Sneed out there instead of Kevin King? Side note, Tramon Williams has a perfectly clean game-used jersey from the 2020 NFC Championship. I will never let that go. Mike Pettin, why didn't you play Tramon Williams? The storyline was there. For that matter, T. Higgins or Michael Pittman sure would have been nice to have in the 2021 playoffs. Everyone likes to blame Aaron Rodgers for the failure to target somebody other than Davante Adams on what amounted to the season-ending play where he chucked it up for Adams. And yes, that was a bad play. But again, look at the context here. Here were the active pass catchers available for the Packers in that game. Davante Adams, Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, Equanimeous St. Brown, Juwan Winfrey, Amari Rodgers at receiver. Then at tight end, you had Mercedes Lewis, Josiah DeGuara, Tyler Davis, and Dominique Daphne. Putting a little context to that, Equanimeous St. Brown played 19 snaps on offense, and Rodgers and Winfrey played 0 apiece on offense. Randall Cobb was playing his first game back from a serious injury that kept him out most of the second half of the season. Marcus Valdes-Scantling was injured in the Packers' Week 18 loss to the Detroit Lions. So your wide receivers were Davante Adams and Allen Lazard. Your best tight end was Mercedes Lewis. Yeah, I'd have locked on to Davante Adams too, and so would you. That he was the only one-on-one matchup winning receiver on the field for that entire game. There's really no other way to spin that. And had you added receiver talent at the end of the 2020 draft, chances are things would have been different in that game. You would have at least had, in theory at least, and I know there's a bunch of other variables that go into this, but your wide receiver room would have been deeper than it was in 2020. That's the positive argument, or the negative argument, or whatever. I don't know. That's the one where I'm not wrong. The one where I am wrong is this, or the one where maybe the argument from draft night in 2020 was short-sighted, is that so far, Jordan Love has walked the path that the Packers have needed him to walk. This is, I think, where I have to defend myself from myself a little bit, because draft weekend in 2020, I was careful to say that there is a path for success here. It was a narrow path for success, but there is a path here. I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been winding up for this podcast for a while. Been kind of thinking about the best way to do this, and also Dune 2 just came out. But when you think about the character of Paul Atreides in the Dune books, you want to get really nerdy here for a while, go deep into the Dune book series. Things get really weird. But around book 3 and then 4 with his son, Leto Atreides, the second, actually the third, if you want to get really nerdy, because he's the third Leto. If you know, you know. If you don't, it doesn't matter. But anyway, Paul talks about, in his ability to see the future, something called the Golden Path. This path for humanity's future in the universe. Knowing that it's a very narrow path, and knowing the specific things that need to happen, he's not sure that he can make it there, and he's worried consistently about the things that will happen to the universe as a result of going down that path. I keep thinking about that metaphor when I think back to the path that was laid out for Love and the Packers and Brian Gutekunst on draft weekend in 2020. It has always been a narrow path to success, because look at what needs to happen for that Love pick to be a success. You are a contender window team that is picking a quarterback who's not going to play for at least a couple, probably several years in the first round. The path involved Love sitting until the Packers moved on from Rodgers, which was not a sure thing to ever happen if Rodgers did not retire, given where he was with his contract and his stated desire to retire with the Packers. Then, whenever Rodgers moved on, if he moved on at a time when it still was possible for the Packers to pivot to Jordan Love, then he would have to really show something to justify the contract extension that they were going to have to give him pretty early on. I wrote this week that at thepowersweep.com that the number is not really the problem with quarterbacks. You're paying to have certainty at the position. It's just that you would not have certainty. You would not be able to give that contract extension to Jordan Love unless he showed something pretty early on. Well, here we are. Jordan Love sat for a few years, looked a little bit rough out of the gate there in 2023, but down the stretch, he looked like the guy that you would want to invest in. Here we are. If we're walking the golden path, things are going pretty well so far. If Brian Gutekunst is leading us into a glorious future for the Green Bay Packers franchise, we have threaded the needle so far. And that is far from a sure thing. However you felt about Jordan Love, the prospect, quarterback development is not a sure thing. Tom Clements wasn't even in the building when they took him. Actually, nobody was technically in the building because we were in the middle of a pandemic. So no one was actually at Lambeau Field making those picks. But Tom Clements, the quarterback development wizard, was not there. But he's back. Jordan Love did his time, stepped on the field, and was a crucial part of where the Packers have now ended up, and they've done it. That's really what's worked out. It's kind of this weird both-and situation. Yes, it hurt the Packers. I don't think you can get around that from 2020 through 2022 to not have those resources spent helping them actually win in those seasons. But also, it has set the Packers up to be here heading into potentially a new era of contention for the foreseeable future to have Jordan Love on the team now. So it's kind of both. Was I wrong? No, but also yes. But maybe no, but maybe yes again. It's a weird sort of situation. So let's conclude with this. What have I learned? Maybe that's the better question for everything related to NFL takes and football takes and maybe just life takes than were we right or wrong? What have we learned? First, I think the long-term view has to matter as much as the short-term view in the draft. What is a given pick doing for you long-term as well as short-term? Sometimes the answer is going to be nothing in the short term, and that has been the case for a couple of Packers draft picks or close to it. Rashawn Gary did not give the Packers much in 2019. Lucas Van Ness did not give the Packers much in 2023. Jordan Morgan conceivably could be a backup here in 2024. The short term does matter, but the long term matters more because you're taking what they could develop into, and it's always good to keep both the short and long term in mind with every draft pick. Not just Jordan Love, but everyone. Secondly, anything can be good. This is what we've started to refer to as the Weekly Planet rule on Blue 58. One of my favorite podcasts is this Australian comic book and movie podcast called The Weekly Planet. It's a pretty big show, so there's a good chance that you've heard about it. But one of the hosts on that show, they're talking about these weird movie concepts or these pitches. This one studio wants to make a superhero movie about some obscure comic book character that nobody's ever really done anything with. The initial blush would be like, it's going to be terrible, or why would they spend all that money on that, or nobody's going to go see this. But one of the hosts will always reliably say, look, anything can be good. And it's true. I don't think many people thought something like Guardians of the Galaxy was going to be good in say, circa 2016. But that turned out, or whenever that came out, was that 2014? Yeah, it might have been 2014. Farther back in history than I would like to admit at this point. But it turned out to be one of the best comic book movies of that era. There are probably other examples. That one was just off the top of my head. But anything could be good. Sometimes stuff surprises you, even if it doesn't make sense right out of the gate. The third thing is don't be the guy. I've talked about this kind of hypothetical character on the podcast before. I think there are analytics. It's usually analytics-based guys out there. But I think there are guys out there that would rather make the analytically correct choice and be right by their method and miss out on a guy who actually becomes good because he doesn't fit the model. And they would rather get bounced from their NFL front office job because they missed out on the good guy, even though that they were technically right, than do something that goes against the grain. Yes, systems and processes are good to have, but sometimes cutting against the grain, sometimes doing things unpredictably is what's going to make you successful. I'm showing all of my nerd cards in this one, but I used to read a bunch of like pulp fiction Star Trek novels. One of my mom's close friends was a huge sci-fi fan. And one summer they sent me a box of like 150 of these like 200-page Star Trek novels. If you've seen them, like they're a nickel a piece in a used bookstore or something. Most of them are no good. But one summer, I just plowed through, I bet, 75 or 80 of them. At one point, I was reading a book a day. I was early high school. I should have been outside or practicing basketball or something. Instead, I was reading nerdy books. But one of the things that has always stuck with me is a scene in one of those books where Kirk and Spock are playing chess, and Spock should clean Kirk's house, or Captain Kirk. Spock should clean Kirk's house every time they play chess because he knows all the angles. He's a genius-level intellect. He should beat Kirk all the time. But every so often, Kirk steals a game from him because he'll just start doing random stuff that is not analytically sound, but he does it just to mess with Spock because he doesn't see things coming. I think there's some of that at play almost all the time in football because everybody has access to the same information. Just about everybody uses the same systems and processes. Everybody has access to the Jimmy Johnson trade value chart. And yet, there are winners and there are losers. And sometimes I think the way that you find a winner or an edge as a winner is do things that aren't expected. Maybe that is drafting the quarterback when you absolutely don't need one, when you objectively don't need one. Maybe sometimes that's taking the smaller school guy over the bigger school guy. Maybe that's drafting the guy who has no testing numbers versus the guy who has a 10 relative athletic score. I don't know what it is, but don't just be the guy is the lesson to me who banks on the system rather than just trying to get the good players. And that's the fourth conclusion. Getting it right is what matters most. That's the only process that ultimately matters. Most teams are not ever going to win the Super Bowl in a given season. In a given season, you would be better off betting the field than any particular team, just because the odds against it are so long. So if you're a general manager who comes out of your NFL career with a single Super Bowl, you're ahead of most of the guys that have ever held that job. The example that keeps coming to mind for me is the Rams from 2021. They were the pinnacle example of going all in for a while, trading for Von Miller, going out and getting Odell Beckham Jr., trading for Matthew Stafford. They were all in on a very, very short window, and they won a Super Bowl in 2021 with what I think a lot of the analytically minded people out there would call pretty bad process. And yet, they've got a Super Bowl ring now. And their Super Bowl ring doesn't count for less because they won it doing it, quote-unquote, the wrong way. The results are all that matter. So ultimately, we can talk about the process and how people got to a certain decision. That stuff does matter because that's how you repeat your success and grow from it. But success is success, and it doesn't count for less if you go about things the wrong way if you're the winner in the end. Maybe it was lucky that the Packers have ended up with what they've got in Jordan Love. And maybe Jordan Love, maybe he turns out to not be any good after the season that he had in 2023. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think it's going to turn out that he's going to be a pretty good long-term quarterback. The growth from here is anybody's guess, but things seem to be pointed in the right direction. The Packers are on the path to success. And here we are 4 years after a controversial weekend in Green Bay, and things look better for the Packers now than they did then. Whether or not that was the right process or the right way to go about it, that's where they've ended up. And the Packers have threaded that needle and gotten to where they are now, despite anybody's objections at the time. And things are working out pretty well for them so far. So those are my thoughts. Maybe a scattered podcast, maybe a lot of different takes, but the Packers got a good one in Jordan Love. They got him at a time that seemed counterintuitive. But if they end up being right in the end, I think that's all that really matters. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. That's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And before I say the thing that I say at the end, I got to remind you, patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Bonus content went out today, Friday, May 17th. We're doing a trip through the AFC, evaluating everybody's best and worst uniforms in that conference. We did the NFC last summer, doing the AFC this summer. We're in the AFC East right now. A lot of monochrome looks in the AFC East. Not my favorite division for uniforms, but there's some stuff to like in there too. So support us at one of those two spots. You can have access to that stuff and hang out in our Discord server. We've added a couple new members this week, so come say hello. Support us in one of those two outlets, and you're going to help all of us become smarter Packers fans. Because as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.